Hello everyone. My name is Ania Kuwiszko. I'm a curator of the Theater of Hopes and Expectations in Düsseldorf. I would briefly like to introduce Kateryna Iakovlenko, who will be hosting today's lecture with Kateryna Iakovlenko, titled New Generation after Nova Generatsiia magazine, Rethinking the Future. The original lecture took place October 15 in Düsseldorf. It was live in a quite open format, so we decided to do it once again for like a broader audience to put the lecture online. So it will be a little bit different and will be a little bit more dense than the quite open format that took place in Düsseldorf. And now, I'm happy to give over to Katja, who will continue.
Hello and welcome. This is a program, as Anya already mentioned, of the Theater of Hopes and Expectations. This is a project created by Precarpathian Theater Collective and initiated by Kunstkommission and supported by the city of Düsseldorf and Kunststiftung NRW. Together with Anya, I'm a co-curator of the symposium. The subject of our symposium is Nova Generatsiia. This is a magazine of left formation that appeared for 3 years, from 1927 to 1930, and was the instrument of Ukrainian futurism, but was also a platform for Ukrainian cultural discussions of that period and up-to-date translations from European magazines. So since a critical examination of the avant-garde in Ukraine was not possible during the Soviet era, there are still numerous gaps at the international level regarding the reassessment of this part of European cultural history. This symposium, so we decided to do the symposium just to have one more step to make this topic more visible. So this symposium features artistic scholars and lectures about Ukrainian avant-garde and futurism of the 20s and 30s of the last century, and recontextualization about the Ukrainian avant-garde by contemporary Ukrainian artists. The starting point for the creating of this program was the decision of an artist and the graphic designer Ostap Yashchuk, who is a member of Precarpathian Theater Collective, to use Nova Generatsiia magazine as a base for the graphic design of the Theater of Hopes and Expectations. So, and today's speaker is Kateryna Iakovlenko, Ukrainian visual art researcher and writer. She is ADB in new media and communication, focused on the heroic narrative of the Donbass in Soviet and post-Soviet media and art. Her current research touches upon the role of art and culture during political transformation and war. Now she is a visiting fellow at the University College London, School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Kateryna's lecture is New Generation after Nova Generatsiia magazine, Rethinking the Future. So Kateryna, you are welcome to start. I switch the mode. So.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Katya. It's really a pleasure to talk to you and try to speculate on the concept of the future. And I think in that my lecture in this case, it's like really a sort of provocation to rethink our historical, cultural past and intellectual debate in current times, and to see on some similarities and some differences, and maybe to understand what we could do now and how we can use this knowledge in our practices. So the new generation, which is Nova Generatsiia, this is a magazine which existed in Kharkiv in 1927-1930s. And you see this one of the famous cover for this journal. And in the beginning, I also want to say that this was quite intense historical time in Ukraine, and it's connected to the national movement, to the idea of avant-garde, which were touching the whole artistic fields like architecture, visual arts, typography, and many other fields, as well as theater. But also I should emphasize that at this time many people were trying to do revolutionary things, like, for example, to open the new school, which called, I mean, at the time, we shouldn't say new school because we have already a huge institution called New School in New York, but at the time it was new organization which were educated people, and it was created by 6 Ukrainian authors in Kyiv. It's called Ukrainian Art Academy, and now this is like more like Ukrainian Art Academy in and architecture, and it has quite long history. It was built in 1917, but even before there were a lot of educational initiatives from well-known artists who try to like create a new tradition and to create a space for rethinking some artistic and political and social processes. So at that time, as I said, the communities plays incredible role in the creation of such environment and such discussions, and among such organization and communities were Association of Revolutionary Art of Ukraine, Community of Modern Artists of Ukraine, Ukrainian Art Association, Association of Artists of Red Ukraine, Association of Young Artists of Ukraine. But also I have to say that in 1917 it was lots of political organizations as well, and you see it here, like Red Ukraine. It doesn't mean that they all were supporters of the Soviet state, but also we had kind of Ukrainian leftists ideas which were quite different from the Russian and Soviet concept. So this is just a small historical background, and I really encourage you to read more about this time, because at that time we had like 4 different options of variations of the Ukrainian state. So it's quite like really intense political period, and unfortunately we lost it in 1922 when the Soviet Union were created. But still lots of interesting things were happening, and they all were connected with culture. So again, just another remark about the context, that the very first issue of Nova Generatsiia that were published by the group of artists and intellectuals had a programming articles where they were opposing to everything, but one very important article were published in 1929, and it's called Marinetti, Fascism and Futurism. And basically it's also somehow gave us understanding of the optics of thinking of the Nova Generatsiia, that it's all about these interconnections between politics and culture, and also how to see the culture it should be the explanation and the context, how it's influenced by the artworks, and how these shapes we can use in our interpretations. Should we, for example, label the artists as like here, for example, in the case of Marinetti, who is him? He is more like an artist, or he is more like a fascist, or how we can how we can react and how should be our interpretation of his work. And the Nova Generatsiia, it's not article that were published by the authors of Nova Generatsiia, but they reprinted it and translated it. And the idea is that he is both, so you cannot see the person without the context, and especially if it's political context, and especially if he took active position in this. So you cannot avoid this, and this is all should be a part of the interpretation of this artist, and also to a part of his biography. So we somehow should count this when we look at his work. And what is interesting to me, it's also give us some interesting angle to contemporary times, how we can see international art right now, and especially international art which claiming to be a political one. Should we also mention that this, or particular that artists have like such a political position, and this is why he or she is doing this exact works? Or how, for example, like to be more precise, how we can see like Russian art, for example, right now. Do we how to mentioning that this is a part of the regime which are killing people or not? So this is like a huge discussion about the role of art, and especially the role of people who are taking active part in these political events. And oops. And again, one of more remarks about these groups. So at this time, where existed a lot of different groups that has lots of ideas of the future, how we should develop it. And here you can see the quote of Leonid Skripnik. He was a Ukrainian writer and critic, quite famous at the time. And he said that I'm not a supporter of the left front in the art, but this is Nova Generatsiia precisely because it was based on the artistic features, has more significance than many others. I mean, interesting that this article was published in Nova Generatsiia, and I'm not sure that he can say anything different, but the thing is that he was like really one of the active authors of the journal, and also he as I said, was quite active person in Ukraine at that time. But also I have to say that Nova Generatsiia was a community, but not an organization, comparing to Ukrainian revolutionary art, for example, that had the statute and so on, and also another unions. Nova Generatsiia, for me, it's more like a community of people who were engaged in one idea, and also will develop in the journal. And it's interesting that the journal were existed quite long time, and even now we have some magazines and publications that are like existed for 3 or 4 years. So we have this like quite interesting temperation for the magazines and journals, which are basically touches all the cultural topics. But at that time, as I said, this was quite a big issue, and also they produced almost more than 90 issues per year. So it's a lot of work, and they all were writing to the magazine. Like especially the chief, the editor Semenko, who is a poetry writer, and we can find a lot of his poetries in the magazine. But going to the like visual, to connection to the visual arts, I have to mention that magazine has 3 artists who were working for Nova Generatsiia, and this is very similar position to the artistic director, or so the idea was that this person decided and choosing the whole visual part for the magazine. And the first one, it was Vadim Meller, who came in 1927 and who working until April 1928. And then Sotnik changed him and replaced him almost for a year and a half. And then Anatol Petritsky was the last one who was working for Nova Generatsiia. And now I will go maybe more deeply to each biography. So Vadim Meller, he is a well-known theater artist who also worked for cinema. And I should say that Kharkiv at the time was a center for cinema making. They had Vuvku, a huge organization that created and supported movies. And then they also opened another launch in Odessa and Yalta. So the artists were migrating between three of these cities, but Vadim Meller mostly were based in Kharkiv and sometimes in Odessa and Kiev as well. And he also working with Les Kurbas for his theater. And not surprisingly, that first issues has a lot of scenography of Ukrainian and German theater. And I also have to say that German culture, and especially Bauhaus, the Expressionism, Cubism as well, there was people who were working for Nova Generatsiia, they were inspired by the German art, so they printed a lot of translation and also images of artists, and as well as scenography and the design for theater. And Vadim Meller, he was a member of Association of Revolutionary Art of Ukraine, and it's very interesting because I will go to this issue later, but so some of these artists were taking part in different communities. So another one quite famous artist of the time, it's and writer, it's Alexei Poltoratsky. He was a reporter, and he wrote an article about the value of Nova Generatsiia. And it's again interesting that I'm not sure that someone can write criticism of Nova Generatsiia in Nova Generatsiia, just why you should do this. But it's also interesting that they explain everything what each person doing. And Alexei Poltoratsky, he wrote an article about the visual information and the visual identity of the magazine, and he wrote following. Semenko said himself the goal of creating a Ukrainian magazine at the left and the best of the old models. The new generation layout was made by the chief artist of the Brazil theater, Vadim Meller. Even the cover, canary colored glossary paper, title, front layout, principle, and the format was so unlike the magazines of that time. Leftists again, eccentric, unusual for the paleographic traditions of those times, and the montage of pages, the play of fronts, rules, and the cut pages into separate pieces as short lines of the poems divided to the usual rhythm and rhyme, extravagant images. All of this at the time could not help stun. And it's as he said, it was quite extraordinary that they cut these pages to different parts and to publish articles, like to start with one page. So it's more like a book than a journal, but still it's also interesting that they use only small lettering, not the big one. So it's also kind of like simplifies, and also to use this idea of left idea of inclusiveness. Another artist who working for the magazine is a photographer and reporter, and sometimes he was writing as well. His name is Dan Sotnik, and the detail of his biography is unknown. Almost all his materials, photographs are lost in the history. We don't know exactly where is his archive and do we have still access to him. But he did a lot, and we can find some materials in Nova Generatsiia, which is also quite good, because he published a lot of his personal work. He also published articles about how we should see the photography and what actually photography means to the current times, to that current times. And also he published a lot of his colleagues. So I would say that when he come to the magazine, the issues become more so they changed a lot, and especially they start like really publishing a lot of photography, but before that it wasn't like that. So this is part of his series of ironic portraits of his friends, and published in Nova Generatsiia. Some of these people were quite active cultural figures, but yeah, like for example, you can see on the right, it's image by Leonid Skripnik, the one whom I mentioned before, and two others, it's Dan Sotnik. And one more slide with his images and his photo experiments. And also some authors from Odessa who also were using photography. And here I again should mention that unfortunately for Ukrainian history of arts and especially history of photography, this period is quite unknown, and we do not count it as a starting point for the photography, for example, because we just basically didn't have any archives to rethink this heritage and to include it to our past. But as we can see from the Nova Generatsiia, that at that time it was a lot of artists who were working with photography in Kharkiv and Kiev and Odessa as well. And I think that this was connected because of the cinema school, and lots of people were working and engaged as operators or artists in the cinema processes. So there was like doing another job as well. But the thing is that from the magazine and from especially articles of Dan Sotnik, we can see that it was quite big community of people who were interested in photography as a independent art. And one more example from Kiev, for example. And also I have to mention that among all of these artists, there was a couple of women. Unfortunately, again, we cannot find their biographies, exact biographies, but still they were existing in the community and they were present. It's interesting to see how different or not different their artworks was comparing to the male gaze, for example, or what kind of possibility to educate themselves they had at the time. But still, it's lots of questions to figure out maybe for the future research. So the last one artist, it's Anatoly Petritsky, who was a painter and who got his education in Kiev Art School, being student of Vasil Krichevsky and Alexander Murashko. Actually, two of these artists create the Kiev Academy for Arts. And then he also was participating in Venice Biennale with his paintings Invalids. And what is interesting that Petritsky, he also depicted a lot of his friends, and lots of his such portraits were published in Nova Generatsiia. Like, for example, you can see this black and white photography, and one of like on the right, you can see the portrait of Semenko, and they also not looks like ordinary portraits, but he tried to also depict somehow the characters, the personality in these paintings. And also he writes as well a lot, like this is, for example, 3 of his articles in Nova Generatsiia. So he were writing about opera, about theater, and a bit about art. One of quite famous artists who were contributing to Nova Generatsiia is Kazimir Malevich. At the time, he was teacher at the Kiev Art School, and he taught a lot. So his idea from the lectures were taken to Nova Generatsiia and published as a series of articles. So you can see how many articles he published and the topics for it. So he was interested in paintings and the connections with architecture. He wrote an article about cubism, about futurism, about aesthetics, and also he wrote a lot about how artists using colors in the paintings. His articles quite big and has a lot of analysis of Ukrainian, Russian, and the European art. And also there is understanding that he stopped publishing because Nova Generatsiia was closed and there was no more issues in 1930s, but he was ready to do it more, and this is just a start for him to create this theoretical base and theoretical context for his work and for work of his colleagues. And he said, we cannot give any explanation or social origin to the painting. We can consider it as an image without the context. However, such a picture as Rouen Cathedral has a great importance for the art history, and its activity forced entire generation to change their attitude toward the paintings. And the idea of his was that we cannot actually separate this context, especially the political context, from the painter, and describing this painting and describing this artwork, we have to count the idea of the artist first and foremost. So like describing his artworks, we should say what he actually thought at this time and what was his background. So it's sort of like the social politics criticism should be included each time when we see any kind of art. The second famous contributor is Viktor Palmov, and speaking about the futurism, he may be one of the key figures in Ukrainian art. He was born in Samara, but then he moved to Kiev, where he was studied and involved in the artistic discussions. And he wrote also some articles about aesthetics, about importance of color, about how artists should work for the government and for other community, and the relationship between artists in the society, and also the like current problems of the paintings and the visual arts. And he was he died in 1929. Unfortunately, so we also cannot say that he did almost everything that he wanted to. But his heritage and his arts we still can see in museums, and also we can read his artworks. So some of his quotes: the easel painting, having now lost on the old methods of influence, plot and things, moved to abstraction, then the experimentalism and such broke away from the everyday breaths of public life. Hence the need to find something real that is connected with the reality that exists, and since then color has become real for me. And the idea of his paintings is that he's sought the color painting, and he create this term, I would say, that it's the main topic for him. It doesn't matter what he's painting, what is which figure are in his paintings, but the idea is that the color creates everything. And it's, I mean, the new generation, Nova Generatsiia magazine were black and white, but so here I also want to show you his reproduction in color. So you can see his work Red Flag in a black white, and then Viktor Palmov for the Power of Soviets, made in 1927, and this is a collection of National Art Museum of Ukraine. And two more images, they write around the horse, and the 1st of May. Palmov, in one of his articles, he explains the attitudes and the relationship with the colors for artists and art schools in Kiev, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. And he said that for Ukrainian artists, it's more important. And also he said that, for example, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, people who studied art, they studied color only on the first courses, and then they not go into these questions. But also I need to make another interruption, and to say that, for example, Alexandra Exter, who was one of the famous avant-garde artists and who was also taught for self-taught artists, she wrote in a letter to Leger, and in this letter she also emphasized that for Ukrainian artists colors means a lot, and they uses quite bright colors to depict and to better paint the idea, and also this is connected with the natural landscape and the environment of Ukrainian nature. So the color means a lot, not only for Ukrainian self-taught artists, but also for Viktor Palmov. And in these connections to color, he explains his idea of future, and he was one of the key figure in Ukrainian futurism at that time. So I show you three artists who were engaged in creation of magazine. There was working for magazine, and two more artists who were contributed a lot as writers and painters, and they basically reflect theoretical ideas in their articles, so the new generation can took them and to discuss them now. And what they also published, for example, I found for myself quite interesting exhibition, which were called the Second Ukrainian Art Exhibition, and it was dedicated to art in Kiev, Odessa, Donbass, and Kharkiv. And what is interesting to me is that looking after the Nova Generatsiia and finding the catalog from this exhibition, it really looks like a side of Biennale that we can find this format today. And also they try to show a lot of different types of art, not only paintings, but also graphics, sculptures, and photography as well. They had two different sections for photography, one for photography and second one for people who were working for Vuvku. So this was a separate part of the exhibition. And unfortunately, again, this catalog do not give us all information about all the artists. Sometimes it has only surnames, sometimes initials, like the first letter of the name. But then nothing else. It's also do not give us a lot of reproductions, but even having this small pieces of information, we can find that it was quite interesting period and diverse, and many artists were working with different topics, not only the topic of industrialization and urbanization, but also the history, memory, violence, also issues of some social issues, and some works again were abstract, as we can say now. And yeah, and also it's interesting that they published a lot of artists who were their friends, but sometimes they also were criticizing artists, and they had a separate page which called Bulletin and Art Criticism column, where Nova Generatsiia published sarcastic criticism to opponents, and primarily they were opposing to Association of Revolutionary Art in Ukraine representatives. And as I mentioned before, if you do remember, that Meller was one of the figure of revolutionary art of Ukraine. And this is more examples of people who were part of this community. It's Vasil Sedler, Alexander Bogomazov, Mikhailo Boychuk, Timko Boychuk, Ivan Padalka, Vasil Yermilov. So, and many more. I choose a couple of key figures. And maybe I will stop with Vasil Yermilov, who was a painter and designer, who was also part of Kharkiv artistic community, and who taught a lot for young generation, and who was one of the survivors. Fortunately, he lived until 1968, and in 60s he tried to come back to his ideas that he developed in 20s and 30s, but unfortunately, again, it was unsuccessful. And he was a member of lots of artistic communities, and he even was expelled from the Ukrainian Union of Soviet Artists for his cosmopolitanism. But I also should mention that he took a lot from the Ukrainian traditions and Ukrainian understanding of the nature and environment. He was teaching also self-taught artists in the villages, but also he took a lot from them, like for example, this idea of bright colors, and also uses idea of connections of the microcosm and macrocosm, so a kind of like utopian vision. So once Nova Generatsiia published an article about workshops of Ivan Padalka, who was a Boychukist and who was a student of Mikhailo Boychuk, and who followed his ideas, and also the workshops of Yermilov. And the criticism was that it's not the artworks have nothing to do with revolutionary ideas, and also they're not supporters of the social movement. So it kind of criticism on that fact that they were using art differently, and mostly were talking about art itself, but not the connection about the connections with the social environment. And another huge part of criticism that were published in this column, it's criticism dedicated to Bolshevist movement, and some of them were part of revolutionary art of Ukraine. But what is interesting that Boychukism, it's a movement created by Mikhailo Boychuk, and now I will back to this page. He was an artist, a monumental artist, and who also was teaching in Kyiv Academy Art School as one of the founder and professors there. And his idea was to combine the traditions of Byzantine painting and also working with icons with Ukrainian Baroque to the current agenda. So they depict a lot of rural thematics and the peasant, for example, but also they had a lot of references to the religion and to the icons. And this was actually the key problem for the Nova Generatsiia, because they criticize them for this type of bourgeois thinking, still bourgeois thinking, and also to depict in a rich peasant, but for the according to the Nova Generatsiia, everyone should be same, and everyone should contribute to the revolutionary idea, to contribute to the state. So it shouldn't be any differences between them. So you can see some more examples of how Bolsheviks were working. And they at the time created a lot of full-scale monumental paintings together. And this is also one of important things which I should mention for talking about Bolshevikism, so that it was a community, but also they were working together on one piece of production. For example, they created monumental painting in Odessa and also in Kharkiv, in Kyiv, and all of these pieces have some separate authors, but this is all should be represents and the artwork of the Bolshevikism community itself, because this is a collective work. And also I think that this is quite important in that time, because the sense of community was a huge huge thing for the beginning of for the 20s and 30s, and this is why they feel support, and this is why they create new things, because they had this sense of community. They engaged with ideas, they discussed them, and also they develop it further and further. So it's gives this is create this school which were criticized by Semenko and Shkuropi and some other people who were contributed to Nova Generatsiia. So this is a quote of Shkuropi, and who wrote that presently the Kyiv school of the so-called Bolshevikists claims to be one of the 100% revolutionary art and proletarian, but to tell the truth, it's even not cures the place of the hegemon and its representative of the Ukrainian spiritual art, having an inbred attitude toward other artistic directions of the representatives of this school, delightfully mystify everything new and revolutionary in our art, holding the art schools of Kyiv in their hands. As for the Bolsheviks, these Kievan Bohomas were must declare the war on them with the common front, together with the young revolutionary artists and writers, because the work is harmful and reactionary, both from the artistic side and mainly from the civil side and political side. Particularly attention should be paid to the fact that Bolshevikists corrupt the youth, terrorizing them, intimidating them with repressions. Wide public circles should also be interested in this. And the interesting thing to me is that they also using this phrase Kievan Bohomas, which is a sort of game of words. Bohomazov is one of the key, this is a surname, and he was one of the key artists at that time. But also Bohomas could be translated as God who is painting, or painting with the God. So it's connected with religion and to the Christian tradition of fresques and mosaics. So this is how they also trying to make jokes and criticize and emphasize these connections with the bourgeois tradition of art. And what is striking to me is that this criticism was quite brutal, and also they try to encourage everyone to fight with their opponents, which is at that time was quite dangerous, because there was a lot of censorship already, and such articles could be really harmful to the community of the artists. So the main question is when the new generation arrives, and could we say that all these ideas that were created by the Nova Generatsiia magazine were saved and used by the other generation? And the thing is that a lot of these artists and writers who were engaged to Nova Generatsiia, they were killed by Soviets in 1937, 1938. And then it was impossible to mention them in theoretical texts, exhibit their works, especially talking about the revolutionary art and Bolshevism school. All of them were died, almost all of them, and their work was situated in special collections of the museum, and it was impossible to exhibit them until late 80s. So all this memory were somehow closed, and the Soviets tried to destroy this knowledge. But the thing is that not all artists were killed and repressed. Some of them were still alive, and I mentioned before Vasil Yermilov, who tried to come back to his ideas in 60s, and 60s important period in Ukrainian art history as well, because for one hand we have this small processes of liberation at that time. All these artists who were engaged with Bolshevism, it was possible to mention them, it was possible to write text at that time, to start talking about Bolshevism. Even still, it was quite problematic. It was possible to go back to the ideas, but not possible to realize them. And also quite soon the new wave of repression started, and some new artists, for example, like Alla Horska, were killed, and community which she belongs, it was also repressed, and some of the artists was imprisoned. So it was quite important part of time for Ukrainian art history. And then again, it was a huge silence until 80s. But what is also interesting that to this, of course, we cannot say that there is a direct connections between generation and generation. But here I need to quote Ukrainian artists Andrei Bayarov, who were working a lot with the Lviv avant-garde context, and who said that these connections still exist, and they are small and fragile, but still they are presented, and they could be connected with some people who were teaching in school, some people who were part in the community but not as active as the key figures, and also some other people who have this memory, who had this memory. And also the city itself has a huge memory of such movements. So this is all creates this connection between different generations. And the question of Malevich is about connections to the museums and to the history, and he believed that artists contemporary artists shouldn't go to the museum, and he said following: authorities, professional artists, and historians push the young consequences away from the modernity and point to the tomb of old that forms in the of the past and as a source where the young generation can take life. However, every image in the museum and the gallery is the last moment of history. This is a time to stamp. That is why the young generation should never intimate to take museums close and address them in the modern ones. And but still, it's interesting that for Ukrainian art, it's very important to raise the questions connected with the history, and this is how they see their connections with future as well. So, for example, I was speaking about this special font collection that were created in 1937, 1939. And this is specifically the collection of National Art Museum of Ukraine, and the first exhibition of such art what happened in 2015 only. All the time it wasn't I mean it was possible to show a couple of artworks, but still it was the first huge exhibition that represent all of this lost art and forbidden art, and lots of Bolshevikism, and as well as Yermilov and many more were present in this show and were shown by the National Museum of Art in Ukraine. And what is also interesting that in one space were all these opponents and you know, the people who try to discuss political and artistic ideas and who were seeing themselves as even enemies, but still there was in one space when they were forbidden, and they were in one space when the art historians start working with this art, because it shows actually the connections between each other and this discussion between these different communities. And it's interesting that at that time as well, it was another huge exhibition called Heroes and Inventory in the Progress by the National Art Museum of Ukraine. It's happened a bit earlier in December 2014, and were closed in March 2015. And the idea of this show was to the idea of this exhibition was to show the different types of heroical imaginary and heroical imagination. And again, in this space were a lot of artistically and politically opponents, but this is also showed this discussion between different generations of how do they create heroical imaginary, how do they depict political figures, like artistic figures, how do they use color and composition and the thematics as well. And of course, the big issue was the socialist realism, which changed a lot for Ukrainian art. So you can see also this gap which happened during a long time. And this couple of more images. So this is Andrei Bayarov, whom I mentioned before, and who was working and still working with Lviv avant-garde artists. And it's interesting that for some Ukrainian contemporary artists, as I said, it's important to make this research practices and not only concentrating and focusing on their own art, but also to see what artists from the previous generation did and where all of this heritage is, and possibly to contribute somehow to the production of the knowledge. And for example, Andrei Bayarov, he translated a book dedicated to Lviv avant-garde group Artes, and he, as I said, did a lot of research. And of course, this is for artists, for quite active artists, it's takes a lot of time, it means that you cannot, I mean, you can create your own work, but still you give your personal time to someone else. And for me, it's it's very important, because this is how you create your own community and your own, educational system, perhaps even, because all of this knowledge is important and people can take it and use it fully. And for Andrei Bayarov, I interviewed him, and he said that his community is also includes all of these artists who are already dead and whom he didn't know when he was young, but now he's researching them, looking at their artworks, and he's somehow talking with them, continuing this intellectual tradition. And this is one more example from that time. This is example from 90s and 80s. It's series of Oleg Tistel, who were rethinking Grigory Narbut money, actually actual money from the Ukrainian National Republic in 1917. Of course, for Tistel, it was more like an artistic project, not actual currency. One more example, it's UNA Collective, research and design collective of designers from Kharkiv, who were rethinking trademarks of students of Yermilov. And so you can see again this commonness between different generations. And this is another example. It's Vasily Yermilov, who, as I said before, who was trying to come back to his ideas, avant-garde ideas and constructivism ideas in 60s. And this is his unrealized projects. And on this slide, you can see artwork by Nikita Kadan, Victory, White Shelf, and this is a modified reconstruction of the model of monument of three revolutions by Vasily Yermilov, and the metal cups found in the ruin of house destroyed by the artillery strike in Lysychansk. So he tried to also come back to this unrealized utopian thinking in his work, and to put it in the current context and to see how it's different, how the art have been changed, and how the ideas could be used by the new generation of the artists. And there is one more example of his work, his sculptures, also a reference into the Ivan Kavaleridze monuments in Bakhmut, Poltava, and Svetohirsk. Two of these monuments were dedicated to were made in honor to Artem, who was like red activists and politicians. And the second one, it's and the third one, it's a monument by Taras Shevchenko in Poltava. And this is exactly these three monuments by Kavaleridze. And what is interesting that, for example, Nikita Kadan is using this term of postponed future, and for him it means this stop, this gap in the history that were made by Soviets when they killed and oppressed artists, so they cannot develop their thoughts about future and about utopia. So it's sort of the future was postponed, and Nikita Kadan is trying to talk about that and trying to come back to this idea of postponed future. And he also using the a metaphor of wind, saying that his generation is trying to oppose the historical wind, which is also dedicated to the violence. This wind is trying to change everything, trying to destroy it, but his generation, as I said, trying to oppose it and to raise the questions dedicated with the traumatical experiences in history, with the violence, and also with the repressions as well. So they go into the archives, they using a lot of historical materials, they reference into the artists from the previous generation, and also they talking about the memory that could the memories that should also include all of this forgotten past of the histories and blind spots, and they should illuminate all of these problematic issues, and this is how they can come back to this idea of future and to create this future with inclusiveness, with understanding of trauma, which trauma, what type of trauma do we have, and how to work with that, how to eliminate all of these unknown heroes and unknown people who suffered by different radicals groups and so on and so forth. Yeah, this is a part of article by Alexei Poltoratsky and Dan Sotnik, those two artists whom I mentioned before. And what is also interesting, I forgot to say about Poltoratsky and Sotnik, that they were working together a lot, and they reported from Caucasus, from the Donbas region, Luhansk and Donetsk, and also they did reporting from Kiev, meetings and civil gathering. So basically, they produced a lot of interesting reportages from places that were impossible to come, for example, from Caucasus or from Donbass. They reported from the salt mining, so people who lived in the cities can find some interesting from these places or about these places. And again, to this connection to the between generation, and now I will start to speculate more on that. That, for example, this is a photography by Yaroslav Futemsky, who also trying to catch and photograph his friends. And this is also somehow connected to me with Petritsky and Dan Sotnik series, that for some generation it's important to document the community, and because this is community influence a lot and creates a lot of support, a lot of discussions, and also this is a bus for this is a ground for the intellectual discussions and new traditions that is arise maybe right now, or it was created even a bit earlier, but still you have this idea of sense of community and importance of this community to you as an artist and also to the artistic field. And one more comparison is Johann Samborsky, who uses now a lot of typography and words, and also some slogans. Like here you can see to help, to wait, and to fight. His artwork, and I also put it in with the quote of Nova Generatsiia about big lettering, that Nova Generatsiia is refusing to use the big lettering because the small one is cheaper. And of course this is a sort of joke, but this is also sort of political statement. And now we're going to the end of my presentation, and I want to show you just a very fresh example of the artwork. It's Bodger Moroz and his idea of the dirty bottom of the future. And this is his first album, and I would say that this is artworks combining sound, visual materials like moving image, and also poetry. And it's interesting that this new generation looks to the future is differently. And of course, it's not the main topic of which is a dirty bottom of the future, but or it's not dirty, or like where is this, should we use it sarcastically, or should we look at this more seriously? But the idea is that we again should think about the future, maybe differently. Maybe we should see our reality as the future or of the previous generation. And I didn't include the slide of the last example, but it's still a work and ongoing work, and they will publish the book in the early beginning of the next year. In January, it's artwork by Vlada Walizewski and the representatives of the queer community, and they preparing a book about the participation of queer artists and intellectuals in the war and the reaction on war. But also they're working on the project of the future, thinking about this future from the position of future. Like, for example, what we should do to come to this future. Like, for example, they look into the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian culture since in 2015, in 2050, in a position of being in this 2050, and they're questioning what we should do to create this inclusive and democratic community, which would be best for all representatives and all communities, all ideas. So it would be like really realized utopia. And this idea of thinking is different to me because comparing to Nova Generatsiia, for example, they still lived in that exact particular moment. They lived with industrialization, they lived with urbanization, but they dreamed about the future as something that would be someday, sometimes. But for young generation of artists, it's important to see this future and to think what they should do to create this new utopia and to realize it. And I think it's quite different perspective. And this is the last slide for me. It's a small bibliography. Of course, it's not full, but you can find some maybe insights in here. And now we can go to the discussion part.
Great.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this very long list of many artists that need to be researched and yeah, that we have now, like through your lecture, in our minds, or like as a list of names that exist. Yeah, actually, I ask myself do you have questions, actually, Katya?
Yeah, I had a question about the idea of futurism. Also again, and because I was also thinking a lot about the futurism of that period, because it was aimed to kind of distract the environment and make a propaganda, and art of this period made a strong propaganda base for the industrialization of the Eastern Ukraine and Ukraine in general. And now we see that we are coming back to the earth. We want to restore it and recover the nature and think how, and maybe you could name some projects that are working on the idea of Anthropocene, of the idea of us being in this country and living in post-industrial zones. It's also important how we live in the future that they were trying to create for us, and made kind of also some propaganda of this future for us. So
yeah, you're right in that fact that the idea of future look a bit different from that times. And if at that time industry, technology, urbanism was the key topics, and also the war didn't represent and something harmful, but was represents and something as a force for change. So to use, for example, the word war, it didn't mean anything bad. It means that this is just about the ideological and the artistic fights, or opposing to each other, or to debate with each other. But then, of course, we had the Second World War, the repressions in 30s, we had Chernobyl, and all our history was based, not based, but it was full of different types of violence. And I think that this is why, for example, the word of war, it's very different to us, and especially experiencing the war by ourselves. We see that this is not something that could provoke artistic ideas, that this is not something that can bring peace or utopian formats of the creation of something, but this is about destruction, this is about death, and this is about the lost connections again. So I think that for our generation, and for, I would say that even more like for artists who are creating artworks now, it's important to restore all of these connections and to restore the history. And this is, as I mentioned before, Nikita Kadan, who were working a lot with archives, and many artists of his generation was precisely using this topic, especially after the Euromaidan and the beginning of war in 2014. And it was happened because of the huge wave of violence and the first civilian deaths, and the idea that everything could be lost again. So they come to the archives to understand their own position in this, the position of their relatives. And like, for example, Mikola Ridney artwork, Grey Horses, dedicated to the past of his grandfather. So this has all become essential to understand what role for Ukraine in the history was for the Ukrainian artists, and to see vividly and to see more profoundly these connections between violence and art, and how both of them shapes each other. But talking about the new utopia, and you mentioned the Anthropocene, I think that it is a big topic which is connected, yes, with war, but also with all of these environmental issues that are common for everyone in international context as well, and the ecological and environmental movement were happened before. But I would again say that this is not the new topic for Ukrainian art. In late 80s, many artists were talking about the environmental crisis, and because of this political crisis in 90s, they also were using the idea of apocalypse and go into that to rethink that actually there is no possible future. This is only death is our possible future. So they were talking a lot about this idea of apocalypse in a connection with environmental crisis. And for Ukrainian artists experiencing the Chernobyl, it was essential to talk about that. It was Anatol Stepanenko, for example, one of them, Valentin Rayevsky, the second one, also Tetianich, one of the bright artists who were working with environmental topic in 90s and 80s. So I would say that since Chernobyl happened, and after all, but now, of course, it's a bit different discussion comparing to that time, because today we have lots of theoretical texts where philosophers and the intellectuals are rethinking these connections with human and non-human being, and we have works and texts by Bruno Latour, and of course Ukrainian artists are also engaged and know quite good this discussion. And I would say that maybe one of the prominent examples of environmental thinking, it's Alevtina Kahidze, who constantly using this not even a metaphor and topic, but she talking a lot about the environment in the context of war as well. Like, for example, I was presented in her speech in the conference of Tech in spring this year, and she were using the example of pacifism and non-violence, and she were referencing to the plants, and she said that of course it would be like, for example, plants can grow, and if you cut some leaves and if you cut some sticks, still this tree and the plant can exist and can grow and can restore and restore themselves. But if you will cut the hand of the person or the head or leg, it means that this person could be died. And unfortunately, this is a huge difference between human being and non-human being, that we are not living life as a tree. We cannot restore our legs and our hands or like other parts of our bodies, because we just have no this ability to do that. So the truly pacifism is, according to Alevtina Kahidze, is presented on the level of plants, and we can also learn a lot of how these plants communicate with each other. How do they live in the garden? How do they live in the wood or in some wild spaces and circumstances? But we have to see and watch how do they communicate to understand our relationship between each other, between the nature and environment, and also to maybe it could help us to create a new types of relationships for the future. But also the destruction, I think it's one of the important issues right now. And talking about environment, of course, many artists are talking about the destroyed garden. Like, for example, Kateryna Iakovlenko is depicting a lot of such images and talking about that. And this is also, I think, connected with the idea of roots and identity as well, but not in a traditional term like that. Identity is just something, but identity is something also like constructed by different things, like, which is more like also inclusive and integrated to the context, to the like not only ethnicity and political issues, but to many other like cultural and social things. Yeah, so maybe I will stop it here.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. Maybe you have questions or
Yeah, I have a rather practical question. What are like in Ukraine like the main sources? Is there a huge publication about Ukrainian avant-garde? Is there a magazine right now where like in a tradition of Nova Generatsiia, is there a magazine that is like publishing critiques and showing like the the community of artists?
Because and it has lots of topics inside. The first one, it's archive, and we do have some archives, but unfortunately they have not many information, and they, like for example the state archives, they're not including information since 90s, and because of the crisis they lost these connections with institutions, so you cannot find them. But also it's not means that they have all information from the Soviet time, because the Soviets were working a lot with archives, and they destroyed lots of information and materials. So the only one way to restore this knowledge is go to private archives, to people who were carrying all of this knowledge. But again, it doesn't mean that they all have it, because of the risks of life, and because they know that Soviets can come and to check the apartment. It was impossible to keep everything, so some people didn't keep information. So this is a huge task for our generation, to restore the history and to create a new types of archives. But also I would say that now we had this turn in art and like cultural field to create archives since 2014, to document everything, to keep this knowledge and this information. But also I would say that one of them quite recent organization which are working with archives, it's MOCA NGO, Museum of Contemporary Art, and they created a war archive, and maybe it would be published soon. And the goal of this archive is collect all of the information, and especially visual information that artists doing right now. And the second, the task is to create exhibition and texts which are based on these materials and knowledge. And speaking about community, I think that this is like the really a key thing, that community is really plays an incredible role for people, especially for creative people. And Theater of Hopes and Expectation, one of such examples, I think, that this is creates communities, this is creates intellectual debates, and also this is not only knowledge, but the processes that maybe that we cannot say fully the whole impact, but in future it would be in the foreseeable future it would be quite reasonable, and it will resonate with something that will arise quite soon. I also would say that to me it's quite challenging to communities to create institutions after all, because this is a next step, and institutions need huge funding and financial support, not only support of people, but also the material. It needs to be material, and it means that you cannot, the institution should have a structure, the institution should have some products and some activities, and it still need to be supported by someone, or like state or individuals or other organization to continue in this work. And I think that this is challenging, because for Ukraine the economical question is quite important, and many people are donating for the army, but culture now somehow replaced to the like lower position. There is an interest to create artistic projects, but of course the only one maybe thing is that to win in this war, and to win in this war it means to support army and to donate for more weapons and for more resources. it would be interesting to see these processes in the future. I hope that it would be even growing because lots of artists are moved to Europe and US. They have access to the international education, and it still would be interesting to see these connections between European cities and Ukraine, how it will influence the discussion and artworks and what it brings to our context. So I'm really looking forward to it.